Thanks, Ruby, and everyone for putting on this workshop. It's great. I'm Jenny. This is my daughter Emma. We've got a few slides that I'm going to share with you just to give a brief outline of our little book project. Our presentation is about a book that we co-wrote in the initial days of lockdown. Sorry, I'm just trying to do this competently. It's well, so we wrote it between March and June. It's impressed with 0 books should be published next year. I want to stress this isn't an academic book. It's a think piece that's written in real time. First time I've ever done that. Not sure I'll ever try it again. It's surprisingly hard, particularly as a social scientist, where you usually work with the benefit of history and hindsight and a bit of research. Pseudonyms have been used for the young people that we spoke to, but also to stress this isn't an empirical study. That kind of work needs to be done in the future, and I have no doubt will be done. So the focus of the book is really on what's become known as the class of 2020. So this is teenagers largely, broadly between the ages of 16 and 21, encompassing young people who had formative educational, but also kind of life milestones they were facing this year. So Emma would have been sitting like a million GCSEs, and they were swiftly cancelled. Gracie, who we quote over the side, she's a student in America who missed her graduation from university. And you see there's this kind of whole kind of bunch of kids who are sort of on the way to adulthood, where things suddenly got stopped in a bit, well, due to COVID-19 and then the process of lockdown. So we were interested in how they processed that experience, what it meant for them in terms of the kind of formative experience of growing up, and also how they responded to the effect of lockdown itself, which, I mean, I've described perhaps quite controversially as a kind of conditioned impotence, where young people were asked to, do something for their country, which basically meant sitting at home and watching Netflix and not going out and not doing anything. So it was a kind of a strange way for young people of exercising their agency at a time of national crisis. There were 3 motivations for me for writing this book. Emma will say a bit at the end of the presentation about some of her insights and reflections. I felt initially that when Prime Minister Boris Johnson described COVID-19 as the worst public health crisis for a generation, this was likely to be epoch defining. And so, given that all my previous work has looked at generations, I felt that this was a moment that obviously I needed to engage with. As an educator, and also a mother of children at school, I was actually very shocked by the speed by which schools and universities worldwide close their doors to young people. And, as we're seeing in the UK, there's sort of reluctance, almost paralysis, in terms of opening up again and welcoming them back. There was a statistic in May quoted by the World Bank, I think it's the 7th of May, that they pointed out that worldwide 85% of the world's children were not in school, which I just thought was striking and extraordinary. There are obviously reasons kind of why that happened, particularly in the initial phases of the pandemic. And yet, given the age and mortality, morbidity profile of COVID-19, we know it has a much more fatal effect, a much more dangerous effect the older you get, and for children tends to have much less of an effect. I thought that was really quite worrying and needed investigating. It was one of the many unprecedented things about this time. And thirdly, as a mother of teenage girls, I basically needed to find a way of helping them to make sense of the crisis. And Emma and I think, took the view that the only thing we could do was to try and think our way through it and sort of work out what was going on. Now, just to the scope of the book is fairly tightly focused on generational consciousness. This is a theme that I followed in sociology. It was I suppose most famously first addressed by Karl Mannheim, writing in 1928 about in an essay called The Problem of Generations. And he was trying to kind of theorize what a generation meant and why it was significant, and what the process of cultural transmission was from one generation to another. And his argument was that generational consciousness, or that sense of a generation becoming, having a sense of itself, was forged in times of intense and rapid social change. And I think looking over the 20th century, you can kind of see that in the cultural generations that we have become familiar with. So the baby boomers came of age in the 60s, the generation 1914, First World War generation, the millennials obviously had 9/11, the experience of the millennium. And so this seemed to be a moment that would give its own imprint. We chose Corona generation rather than COVID generation, because COVID generation seemed to be rather depressing and kind of imply that young people would just be stamped by this moment. Whereas following Mannheim, the process of generational consciousness arises through young people working through their own experience of the time, and crucially, in relation to the generations around them. So it's about the relationship between kind of older and younger people, parents and children, teachers and educators, how we come to make sense of the moment. And young people and older people, because of the location of this kind of crisis within the life course, will come at things in different ways. I should stress that while the book's not complete, it's not supposed to sum up an entire generation experience. That work needs to be done. And we're not trying to imply that the crisis has been worse for young people than for older people. I mean, obviously, the flip side of younger people being at less physical risk from the disease is that older people would have had much more kind of clear and present dangers, really. But we're trying to sort of say that this experience is likely to be formative. So I'm just going to finish with like 3 things that I thought was really striking before handing over to Emma. I think if there was an overriding sense of the moment that we got from writing this and from talking to young people and engaging with the discussion as it was going on, I think it was a sense of sort of symbolic abandonment. I mean symbolic, not practical. Obviously, we didn't abandon our children physically, we just locked them in their houses. But there did seem to be a sense that of adult society kind of really pushing young people away, symbolised by schooling university closures, symbolised by what was at points very deliberate promotion of fear among children about the disease, but also a fear of children. I think the metaphor of the child as the asymptomatic carrier of COVID, who is particularly dangerous because they don't get ill, to me seemed a very disturbing kind of idea about kids that we were developing in this context. And also the role of social media, which Emma might say something about, was also very striking, that the young people we talked to always use this counterposition of social media is great, but it's not the same as real social interaction. And I thought that was very interesting, that really showed that young people don't just substitute Zoom or house party or whatever for physical kind of old-fashioned contact with each other, and they really felt a lack of that, what they called real social interaction, when they were just reliant on using the technology. So
yeah, so I think a lot of what I was trying to write about was more about how, like, I felt that myself and most of my friends and the people that closely surrounded me felt during the immediate effects of the virus, because from what I thought was, or anticipated, it was very different from what I had expected. And so I think a lot of what we felt was less anger than what I thought. I thought the frustration of the exams and the closures and being isolated would have been much stronger, whereas I think more of what it was actually just surprise and shock. And I think a lot of it was about feeling lost within ourselves and really realizing what we were missing with more. It wasn't even the big exams, which I think a lot of people cared about, especially now we've gone through it. A lot of us are like, well, at the end of the day they're just like exams and stuff. But I think a lot of the clearest thing that I wrote in the book was like the lack of casual conversation and like getting into a conversation with people that you wouldn't necessarily message. So between the first like few weeks, there was just so much like it just felt so isolating, because not only were you only talking to those people who you were very close with, and at a time when you're growing up there aren't as many people you're particularly close with, it's much more of a broader sense of like a community within a year. But also the fact that there was a lack of things to talk about, and there was a lack of ways to communicate with each other, because all that there was to talk about was the crisis, but we couldn't do anything about it. We couldn't go out, we couldn't experience anything new. Everyone was just kind of sitting at home. So not only were we not doing anything, but we also had nothing to talk about with the time we had gained. And I think what's not addressed as much in the book, but what I wanted to talk about was how that has changed from now. So obviously since we've written the book, the whole explosion of like the Black Lives Matter and all of that, I think really showed how much people had kind of felt that their communication was like diminished, because it gave them something to talk about. And I think that's partly why everything exploded, because they had a pinpoint, they had an opinion. So everyone became a lot more expressive than I think that they had been before, because they got the chance to speak and they got the chance to talk about something that wasn't directly affecting like your current crisis. And I think like that really showed that people have gained like our age have gained a new perspective which they wouldn't have gained at home, because they now see the world wider than themselves. And by taking away the exams and taking away the pressures of our individual lives, we then get to see what's around us and get to experience what everyone else is experiencing in a more grown-up way, and in a way that we are just taken out of ourselves. And I think that's seen even now, whereas coming out of lockdown, we can go out and but we're not talking about what happened anymore. We're talking about the future, and we're talking about like things in a much more general perspective, rather than just the events of school, just the everyday little things. And I think that just shows how much this has shaped us and matured us more than taking exams or any other kind of school events would have.
So just to conclude, I mean, I think our conclusion was that how the so-called Corona generation will make sense of this moment remains an open one. And it's obviously quite, most of my other work has talked about the dangers of commentators second guessing and kind of scripting a future for young people, because that's not how it works. But I think the balance that I would put on it is that, you know, we do need to kind of move on and allow people to young people to make a future for themselves. But also I think we shouldn't forget too quickly some of the kind of quite disturbing features that have come out of this moment in terms of the symbolic relationship between adult society and its children. I think it does leave us with some quite big questions to ask, and we shouldn't forget about those by rushing to move on. And that's it. Thank you.